have with us, like I said, Jeff Mattocks, Baylor, Lansden, and Rachel Teller. So Jeff Mattocks, I believe some of you may know, he has 26 plus years experience in animal nutrition. He's also the author of Niche Poultry Feeding and Management. Baylor started his agricultural career with an education in food security. Afterwards, he got practical experience in agriculture through diversified farming, concentrating on pasture-based chickens, eggs, and pork production. And Rachel has a background in dairy nutrition and experience raising dairy goats, beef cattle, sheep, horses, and rabbits. So goats can be a fun addition to a homestead, and often people want to start with their goats because it's smaller than a cow, it's easier to handle, doesn't take up as much room. You don't need a trailer like a cattle trailer to move it. They eat less than a cow, and they still give you, a fair amount of milk. You can count on maybe 2 quarts of milk per day. But they're also very curious, so that can get them into trouble. And they are also incredible escape artists. So tonight we will cover the basics of goat nutrition with examples of balanced rations and guidelines on the nutrition required at different stages of life and production. We will also cover the main illnesses that commonly affect goats, how to prevent them, and how to deal with them if they occur. At the end of the presentation, there will be a time when you can ask questions. You can just type them in the comments. But if there is something that you feel is, relevant when we are presenting, feel free to type them in, and I'll put them up, and we can answer them right away. So, Rachel, why do I want a goat?
Because they're lots of fun. All right, is my screen up?
I see it.
You see it?
It's not full screen. It's your presentation.
Okay, there we go. Are we there now? Okay, sweet. All right, guys. So thank you for tuning in tonight to listen to us talk about goat nutrition and management. As Ingrid said, we're going to go over some basic nutrition concepts about goats, some common ailments that can be attributed to nutrition, and some other common things that happen to goats along the way. As with any of the other animals that we've talked about so far, there's a lot more to learn and to get into. So this is really just kind of grazing the surface of what you can do with goats, how to take care of them. If you have further questions, as Ingrid said, please feel free to reach out to us and contact us. So when you do start with your goats, you're thinking about getting goats, you have to think about why are you raising your goats? So what are your goals? Are you raising them for meat production, for dairy production, for breeding purposes? Are they just going to be your pets? Or if you're going to be showing them? Because this will then determine the different breeds that you're going to get and different management styles that you can possibly do. So throughout the world, there's actually about 83 different breeds of goats. So you've got a lot to choose from. So when you're trying to choose what breed of goat would work best for you, some things to think about would be the climate that you live in, that you're going to be raising these goats in, and where these goats come from. They come from all over the world. We have some that are from the Swiss Alps, so they're better at cold weather. We have some that are from, Africa and warmer climates, so they're going to be more suitable for those hotter temperature areas. Again, think about what your potential management style is going to be. How hands-on do you want to be? How hands-off do you want to be? If you're raising dairy goats, are you going to be milking them twice a day, once a day? Those sorts of questions. Are you going to be using forage and pastures at all? Do you have the land for forage and pasture? Are you going to be bringing in the forage? Those sorts of questions. And then, of course, cuteness. Because, come on, who doesn't love a goat? They're awfully cuddly. They have great personalities. And honestly, they rival dogs sometimes. They will definitely follow you around and do things for you and keep you entertained. There's never a dull moment when you're in a goat barn. So to get us started on the nutrition requirements of a goat, I just wanted to talk a little bit about their digestive system. So as you can see from the diagram, a goat's digestive system is very similar to a cow or a sheep. They are ruminants. And as such, if you look at the picture of their mouth, you can see that they do have a set of lower incisors, and on their top, they just have that soft palate. That is ideal for them ripping plants material, blades of grass, leaves, brush, being able to chomp down with their teeth against that palate and rip that plant so that they can then consume it and chew it and get the nutrients from it. So if you look at the diagram of their digestive system, once they do eat their plant, it's going to travel down their esophagus just like us, and then it's going to go into their rumen, which is their fermentation vat, which is where microbial digestion is going to take place, and the plant material is going to break down through fermentation. Any particles that are too big to go through the rest of the system are then going to be regurgitated, and the goat is going to re-chew them or ruminate until those particle sizes get small enough that they can go through the remaining chambers of her stomach. So after the rumen, it goes to the reticulum, the omasum, and then the abomasum, which is the true stomach, where acidic digestion is going to take place for any undigested material. After that, it's going to go through the small intestine and the large intestine. And again, any digestive that has not been digested or absorbed is then going to be removed as waste. So what are the requirements for goats? So in general, goats need to actually consume about 2.5 to 3% of their body weight as dry matter. So that means a 100-pound goat can be expected to eat about 3 pounds of dry matter per day. So dry matter is how we kind of equal out all of our feedstuffs to make sure that we all start on the same level and make sure that the requirements are all, or the nutrients are getting all the same attention. So we do this by removing the water content of whatever forage it is, if it's silage, if it's hay, if it's grain, and we basically start the nutrients out all on the same level. This is a requirement, which means that goats need to eat this much. However, during certain stages of life, they might actually need to eat more to meet their needs. They could actually consume 4 to 5% of their body weight in dry matter during certain stages of life. So again, that 100-pound goat is now going to be consuming 5 pounds of dry matter. However, there are times where the goat can't consume this much because they don't have that much room in their rumen. Although the rumen can store a lot of feed, it's not an endless, supply and endless fat. There are constraints to it, and they might not be able to eat all of the food or all the requirements that they need. So we want to make sure what we feed them is going to be nutrient dense and is going to supply everything that they need to live. Again, this needs to be filled on a daily basis. All requirements do. It's not, every week they have to consume this much, or every month they need to consume this much. Every day they need to be eating this much food. Okay. And a lack of dry matter intake from good sources can actually lead to goats eating less desirable things. And this can cause some problems. Baylor's going to get into this a little bit later about some poisonous plants and what can happen if goats are eating less desirable things. So for goats to grow and their overall nutrition, obviously their intake is going to increase as they get bigger, and which means that they're going to eat more. So as a goat eats more or increases their intake, we can actually decrease the amount of energy and protein that we're feeding to them, because by eating more, they're still going to be consuming the same amount of energy and protein as if they were eating less of a feed that's higher in energy and higher in protein. So if you look at the chart, you can see a goat that weighs about 44 pounds is going to eat about 1.4 pounds per day of dry matter intake. And that's going to go all the way up to, if you look at one of those does, a mature doe weighing 132 pounds in late pregnancy with twins, she's going to be eating 4.3 pounds of dry matter intake per day. So you can see how those requirements are then going to decrease in that feed because of the increase of consumption. In general, the highest energy requirement time for a doe is going to be during late pregnancy. The last third of the pregnancy is when the growing fetuses, the growing kids inside of her, are going to put on the most amount of growth. And so this is one of the reasons why her energy requirement is going to be so high. This is rapid growth of the growing embryo. She's getting ready to start making milk and starting her lactation curve. And just there's a lot of energy that is required. This is slightly different than with ewes and cows. So it's just a note to show you guys how goats are not just little cows. Even though we like to think of them like that, there are some differences. Just like a lot of people think that sheep and goats are the same thing, but they really are not. Okay. So when we do have a doe that's approaching late pregnancy, we want to watch her feed intake carefully, and we want to make sure that she's not getting too fat. As you can see from the picture there, we've got a very pregnant doe. She's very uncomfortable, but at the same time, I believe she has triplets in there in this picture. So we want to make sure she doesn't get too fat, because that can cause problems during kidding, before kidding, as well as after kidding, which we'll get into. And we also want to make sure that when the doe goes into being breeding season and getting pregnant, that she's also not too thin. So we do want to make sure that the body condition keeps up with what we need it to be. So once she gives birth, what do we do with our kids? Well, goats are mammals. So obviously then for the first several weeks of life, the goats are going to be basically consuming mother's milk. That's where they're going to be getting all of their nutrients from. That is what milk is designed for. Whether you are dam raising or a bottle raising, and yes, I know that there are lambs and kids on that lamb bar, but goat's milk is Mother Nature's milk replacer. So we often raised both our lambs and goats together if we needed to. But again, whether they're bottle raised or dam raised, the kids will actually start to nibble solid food pretty soon after birth. So you do want to make sure that they've got some high quality hay or forage or even a little bit of grain available so that they can start nibbling. This nibbling that they do actually helps stimulate their rumen development. So it's very important to make sure that they have appropriate scratch, meaning hay and fiber, to stimulate the rumen papillae and microorganisms to form. So it's a very important stage of development for the kids. By the time kids are 4 to 6 weeks old, they're actually going to be obtaining about half of their nutrients from sources other than their mother's milk. So at this time, it's going to be appropriate to start giving them more grain if you're choosing to feed them grain. And again, making sure that they have plenty of high quality hay and forage available for them to eat. If you are using a creep feeder, this is a perfect time to make sure you've got your creep feeder set up, because this is a great way to provide extra nutrients to the kids. They can go in and out as they please, and they have food available to them at all times without having to compete with the adult does that are in there with them. Not only are these does going to be, 4 times their size, the rulers of the barn can be quite pushy, and they're not going to let a little 20, 30 pound kid stand in their way of getting some grain. So it's very hard for these young kids to compete with the older does for the nutrition that they need as they're growing. So having a creep feeder there, it's going to be better for them. It's also more efficient to feed the kids directly than to feed the doe to produce more milk. Again, at this point of development, at 4 to 6 weeks old, these kids are going to be eating more or about the same or more, grain or other feed than milk. So the does aren't going to be able to produce enough milk to provide all of the nutrients to them. We want to have that other source for them available. So during lactation, does actually have higher requirements for the first 6 to 8 weeks. This is, as they're approaching their peak. This also coincides with when they're still nursing their kids. So they're going to have that higher need of milk production and the higher nutritional need to support the milk production. During lactation, energy and protein needs increase 30 and 60% above maintenance levels, respectively. So we need to make sure that our does have that increased energy available and that increased protein available, because not only are they just recovering from kidding out, again, they've started lactating, so they're producing milk, and they're also, they're fixing their body at the same time and maintaining their body. They have to keep their body weight up, their body condition score, as well as have their reproductive tract go back to normal and get ready for it to be bred again. As a general rule of thumb, if you do have the kids on the does, you're going to feed about 1 pound of grain per kid if you're feeding grain, with access to better quality and quantity of pasture and forage. Again, the two go together, hand in hand, making sure that everything is of high quality to make sure that the does are getting a balanced ration and meeting their needs. And Baylor's going to talk about this a little bit later too. Just like with cows, does should be separated into different production groups for feeding. So your high producers should be grouped together, your low producers should be grouped together. And in the same manner, then the yearlings should be fed and managed separately until they freshen as well. If you keep your yearlings in with your does that have just freshened, you're going to run into issues of having yearlings that are over-conditioned with a lot of extra flesh on them. And that's going to lead into issues of they might not get bred as soon as you want them to, or if they do get bred, they could be overweight when they do give birth, and we can have some issues there. I can't tell you the number of times in the show ring I've been told that my dry yearlings, they could use a kid on them, basically telling me nicely that they were fat. It's a very common problem to have, and one way to minimize that is to feed them separately. So with our does in lactation, again, we want to make sure that we've got high quality feed going into them because they do have these higher nutritional requirements. As you can see, we decided to feed them some animal crackers, having a little fun with them. But you want to make sure that they have a high quality forage available. 16 to 18% protein is a good protein level, and you want to have 20% or higher NFCs. So these are going to be non-fiber carbohydrates. They're going to be able to break down fast, give her a fast dose of energy. With any animal, and milking animals in particular, we want to make sure that our calcium and our phosphorus are balanced. So with our goats, ideally, you want a 1.4 to 1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. This is going to make sure that she has plenty of calcium for milk production, as well as body maintenance and everything else. And it's not going to lead to a mineral imbalance that can lead to other nutritional issues. And we also want to make sure that the forage has a lignin total under 6%. So lignin is the undigestible fiber portion of the plant cell wall. It adds structure, and usually the older the plant, the higher the lignin we have. So in our forages, we don't want very old, stemmy, woody forages because that's going to be very high in lignin. We want to make sure that we're optimizing harvest time so that we have a decent yield, but that our plants are not too old. And again, that lignin content is not too high. And if you're feeding a grain with your forages, we want to make sure that we balance our grains according to the forages so that it does support the calcium to phosphorus ratio of 1.4 to 1, as well as making sure that they're still meeting all their protein and energy needs. And again, just like with if they had a kid on them, about 1 pound of grain is going to translate to about 1 quart of milk production. So something that is a lot of times forgotten about on the farm is going to be our bucks. And not that we forget that they're there, especially with the upcoming rut season. You can't really get away from their stink. That is very unavoidable. But a lot of times their care and condition are forgotten about. We think we can just kind of put them out in the back lot or somewhere in the barn and kind of let them be. But that's not the case. We still need to keep good care of our boys too, because they are half of the equation when we're looking at breeding season. So just like our does, they should be fed a balanced grain for maintenance. Again, once they are mature, we don't want them gaining any weight, getting over-conditioned, getting under-conditioned, or anything. We want them to maintain proper body condition for everything that we want them to do. Again, once the buck is mature, they should be fed grass forages. This is very important. We really want to cut down the number of legumes that they are feeding because just like the does, we wanted to keep that 1.4 to 1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. We don't want the bucks getting too much calcium in their diet and having an imbalance of calcium and phosphorus. And legumes are going to provide a lot of extra calcium in their diet. So we want to make sure that they're getting grass forages. And this is important because the calcium to phosphorus ratio and an imbalance in it can cause urinary calculi. And we'll talk about urinary calculi a little bit later too. Anything that you want to do to the buck for breeding season, you actually need to do about 3 months ahead of time. And this is because the life cycle of sperm actually takes about 90 days to maturation. So that means that the sperm that the buck is producing now is actually going to be the sperm that's going to be used for breeding in September. So whatever you're doing now to the buck is going to affect breeding season in 3 months. So if you need to give any mineral supplements or any vitamin supplements, now's the time to do it. And again, talking about urinary calculi, is ammonium chloride necessary to be feeding to bucks at all the time? That is a big question with a big debate. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about urinary calculi. Baylor's going to take over now, but I think we might have a question in there.
I do have a question for you. What grain is best for goats? Would you say? Because I know that some grain is, what we used to say, too hot. So, you have to watch. Is it barley? Is it oats? Which would you recommend?
So again, it's making sure that you have a balanced amount. So corn is going to have the highest starch content. It has a lot of starch, and starch is easily digestible, and that's usually what we consider to be a hot grain. Any grain that has highly digestible starch in it, that can throw out off the rumen environment and cause issues like acidosis. But if you are combining it with appropriate forage and hay and things that are high in fiber, the goats are going to chew more, and they're going to naturally buffer their rumen then.
Okay. There is Baylor. I'm going to...
Perfect transition to rations. All right. Okay, so these are just some sample rations for y'all. They are not, they're not set in stone, but they're formulated to meet the energy and protein needs of the grain supplement of a goat diet at different stages of life or production. If you, again, choose to feed grain. So all the way here on the left side, we have our 16% lactating goat, and that's built on corn, roasted soybean, oats, molasses, a mineral, and salt. The corn is there for the energy. The roasted soybeans are there for energy, fat, and protein. The oats are there for energy and also fiber. And like Rachel was just talking about, corn tends to be a hotter starch source, and oats tend to be a cooler starch source. Their starch is less available, and there is less starch in the oat as well. Molasses is there for taste as well as for energy. The goat NutriBalancer is there for the mineral part of the ration, and as well as the vitamins. But we have goat NutriBalancer here. We don't have to have goat NutriBalancer per se in the ration. I know that our Canadian customers don't have access to Fertrell's goat NutriBalancer, but maybe in the question time, we'll talk more about other options that y'all may have. And then as you can see, the rations will go down in protein, as Rachel was referencing earlier, as the production changes. So lactating, we have higher needs. A stocker will have lower needs than a lactating goat, and a maintenance goat, so an adult in maintenance, will have lower needs yet. All right. I'm not getting my... Oh, there we go. Okay. There we go. All right. So a corn and free ration is very possible. It just takes a little bit more complexity with ingredients. So these ones are based on peas for the protein ingredient, oats and barley and wheat for the energy side, as well as flax meal for protein. We have our goat NutriBalancer there, and then molasses, added fat, because we don't have those roasted soybeans there to bring the fat in. The fat is important for the general health of the animal. They need a certain amount of fat, but fat is also a very efficient energy source that we can have a certain amount of in the ration. Okay, so we wanted to take a moment to talk about forage-based diets, because obviously they are ruminants, so they don't need to have a grain supplement. However, if you are feeding a 100% forage diet, you have to be very conscious about your total profile of forages. So you're going to need to match that, just like we were talking about with the grain, to the different life stage or production stage of your animal. So whenever you're having a lactating animal, you want to make sure that you're getting a lot of energy and protein into that animal. If you're doing this through forage, as Rachel mentioned earlier, you're going to have to concentrate on protein from early stage grasses and some legumes, as well as energy from majority grasses that are bringing in a digestible fiber as well as sugars. So you're going to need to maintain a forage stand for that growth, for the growth and production cycle of your goats. And then you're also going to need to maintain a yearly forage inventory for your goats as well. And this will be incredibly important for our Canadian customers, as I'm sure Ingrid could hit on, because y'all have a much smaller growing period of time than we do down here and then further south. Your pasture profile is going to depend on where you are in North America or the world, obviously, but we do want to err on the side of caution of having too many legumes. There is the potential to have bloat with too many legumes, but as Rachel was hitting on earlier, goats are going to need a tighter calcium phosphorus ratio than we're normally looking at for cattle. And our legumes are bringing in a lot of calcium. So we don't want to have a stand that's too high in legumes for that reason, as well as others. Okay, so poisonous plants. And this is a really scary slide. It's not meant to be scary. When I started grazing on the cattle side, I was very afraid of poisonous plants, obviously because they are poisonous and you hear a lot of stories. However, just to calm things down a little bit, if you are in an environment where one of these plants exists and your goats are well fed and well maintained, and one Jimson weed happens to come out in your pasture, usually the animals are smart enough to avoid that. Or maybe if they pick at it a little bit, then they'll move on. Typically, these aren't a problem unless there's a huge abundance of these plants or they don't have other options to get other forage. So there are a few categories of possibly poisonous plants, and some of these are only poisonous at certain times of the year or their life cycle. So alkaloid containing plants, a lot of these are really familiar to us. So the Jimson weed pops up and it looks like a scary witch in and itself. So you kind of know, oh, that's toxic. Indian hemp looks a little bit more benign, but they'll just pick a little bit of it and then possibly move along. There's a cytogenetic plants. So these plants are poisonous mostly when they are frost damaged. So that includes laurels. So we have a lot of mountain laurels around here. That's something to think about. Black locust, that's something we have pretty commonly. You might want to think about. Milkweed and Sudan grass as well. Saffonin containing plants. These plants will cause physical damage to the intestinal system. And photosensitizing plants, these are plants that, if eaten at really high amounts, will cause there to be a higher likelihood of sunburn and light sensitivity. But again, with all these plants, it's about the dose and the access and how much gut fill they already have and how much they're trying to fill their rumen, as Rachel talked about earlier. Okay, and so Rachel will take on from here and finish us out.
That was a little more seamless. You're muted, Rachel.
I always do that. I'm sorry.
No problem.
All right.
And while I have you here, I'm trying to answer to your comment, Alyssa, about mineral deficiencies. Yes, we will cover it. For some reason, I can't find your comment on the Facebook page, but we will cover it, yes.
We will talk a little bit about it. We're not going to go too in depth, but if you do have any further questions about it, we can definitely answer them for sure. So after talking about how different plants can be toxic, obviously we have some other issues that relate to other topics that we've talked on already. So pregnancy toxemia or ketosis, this is going to affect our does during late gestation when they have an inadequate intake of energy. And this goes to the whole overfeeding, underfeeding, and making sure that they are being fed a balanced diet. Ketosis happens when fat breaks down in the animal because they're trying to get more energy, and fat is 2.5 times more, so has more energy dense than both protein and carbohydrates. As Baylor said, fat is a quick and easy way to get some energy in, and a good source of it. So again, the animal's trying to produce their own energy by breaking down fat, and this is going to produce toxic ketone bodies that are going to build up in their system and cause an issue. Again, overfed and underfed does are more susceptible to ketosis, and you need to get energy into the doe as soon as possible. She is really lacking in that energy, and she needs it to survive. Depending on how far along she is in her pregnancy, you might need to do an emergency C-section to get that kid out, to make sure that you have a live kid on the ground. Obviously, if it's too early, the kid's not going to survive. There's a chance that the kid may have died in utero anyway if she doesn't have enough energy to support the development of the kid. And pregnancy toxemia or ketosis can happen after kidding as well if she still has that energy imbalance. So you can give some propylene glycol or IV glucose, or even put some molasses in some warm water if she's drinking to encourage her to drink. All these things are going to be very easily digestible carbohydrates that are going to give her energy very quickly. Another common one that you will also see in cows or any animal that makes milk is going to be milk fever or hypocalcemia. This is typically seen in fresh does in early lactation and is caused by a calcium imbalance. So usually they have low blood calcium, and so therefore they can't support milk production because there's not enough calcium. And it's caused by not enough or actually too much calcium in the diet. When the doe starts to lactate, she needs to mobilize that calcium to get into her uterus, into the cells that are going to be making the milk. And if she can't mobilize that calcium, she's going to start trying to pull it from every which way she can. And that's going to cause an imbalance and cause milk fever. So again, we want to manage our dry does differently than those that are still milking. Similar to cows, we want to make sure that they don't have too much calcium, but they have just the right amount. And we want to balance that ration accordingly. And for any does that do have milk fever, you can give a calcium solution, CMPK, any calcium gluconate, anything that's going to give them that quick dose of calcium so that they can, again, support their body functions and then also support milking. We mentioned urinary calculi very briefly with our bucks. But here I'm going to expand on it. So this is where mineral stones or mineral buildup, and they get lodged in the urinary tract. This tends to be more prevalent in males because of their anatomy. Males have longer and narrower ureters, and so the stones get stuck. Female have shorter, wider ureters or urethras, and the stones typically do not get stuck unless they are very large. And again, the most common cause of stones is going to be a mineral imbalance of calcium and phosphorus in the diets. Whether it's a calcium buildup or even a phosphorus buildup, this can lead to stones. So again, we want to make sure that our feed is balanced, making sure that calcium and phosphorus is 1.4 to 1 around that area. And again, plenty of grass, hay, and forage to not add too much calcium into the diet. In severe cases, especially in bucks, they may require a minor surgery to remove the stones. If you've ever looked very intensely at the anatomy of a buck, you will notice at the end of their penis, they have another structure that kind of just is a smaller version of almost a worm, it looks like. And that the stones can get stuck in that, and it can get cut off and with no effect to the buck whatsoever. So it's a minor surgery. They usually don't even need to sedate the buck or completely sedate the buck. And it's very quick. And so the question about ammonium chloride comes up here. A lot of people feed it as a preventative to prevent stones from accumulating. However, ammonium chloride also tends to be a very common treatment for urinary calculi as well. So if you're constantly feeding ammonium chloride, if they still get stones, it's no longer going to be an effective treatment. So if you can manage stones by feeding them a balanced ration, if they happen to get a very bad case of stones, you still have a way to treat them if you haven't been feeding them ammonium chloride. So it's not necessary to feed to them, again, as long as you have a balanced ration and plenty of grass hay and no other issues going on. Now we have polioencephalomalacia or stargazing disease. This is more commonly seen in kids that are being intensely managed. So usually in the barn, not going out on pasture too much. And usually what you see is the animals stargazing, or basically walking around looking up at the sky, uncoordinated staggering, muscle rigidity, involuntary side-to-side motion of the eyes. Basically, you see the pupils kind of just moving back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this is related to a thiamine deficiency or vitamin B1. So you'd commonly treat it by giving them extra thiamine, and that's going to take care of it. Obviously, really severe cases can lead to death. And there are some other factors that can contribute to a thiamine deficiency as well, which we'll get into. So that ties nicely in with coccidia, because coccidia is a very common issue with goats. It's a protozoan parasite infection. Kids and stressed animals are more susceptible, as well as if your barn is in a wet area or it's a wet year in general. The parasite, the egg basically can withstand some dry periods. And then once you get into the wet season again, they can come back to life and they can infect your animal. Usually you see diarrhea, messy back ends, and lethargic animals. You can confirm this with a fecal test to see what eggs are present in their feces, or you can also give them a FAMACHA score, looking at their eyelids to see how anemic they are. And basically prevention is key. So what this means is, again, making sure that you've got clean, dry bedding in the barn, that you're grazing properly. You're making sure that the pasture is at the right height. You've got a varied pasture. As Baylor was saying, you want to have multiple different species there. There are some plants that have shown to have some natural coccidia prevention, like Lespedeza, and other plants similar. You want to work with your young stock first. That way you're not tracking anything that the older animals have into the younger pens. And if you do get some coccidia, there are plenty of conventional as well as homeopathic options. And so the thiamine issue comes with one of the main conventional treatments, which is going to be Corid or Amprolium. And so the main method of the way that Amprolium works is it actually blocks the thiamine channels. So if you're giving Corid, you can almost guarantee, or you should be on the lookout at least, for signs of polio then, because that means that kid is most likely going to have a thiamine deficiency. So a lot of people then think, oh, if I'm giving Corid, I should also give thiamine at the same time. However, since Corid works by interrupting the thiamine channels, not only are we doing that for the goat, we're also doing that for the parasite too. So by giving them thiamine at the same time as giving them Corid, you're kind of being counterproductive with treating them in the first place. So some homeopathic remedies that you could use instead. One that we recommend at Fertrell is using equal parts of cayenne, garlic, and diatomaceous earth by volume. If you get like a cow bolus, it's going to treat about 300 pounds. So you can use that appropriately, figuring out how much fits into that bolus and how much to give to your goats. Another recipe that Ingrid found that has been used successfully for other goat farmers is a tablespoon of ginger, a tablespoon of cayenne, a tablespoon of thyme, 9 cloves of fresh garlic, finely ground, 1 tablespoon of molasses. And you're going to mix that all together, and you're going to make about 1/4 of a teaspoon size balls, 1 ball per kid, or about 1 to 2 teaspoons worth per adult. At Fertrell, we also carry a bunch of Dr. Paul's products that can be used for coccidia as well. But again, prevention is going to be the best thing to do in any of these cases, because it's easier to prevent it than to treat an entire herd. I've had years where the weather was so uncooperative that not only did it go through our kids, but we're actually losing adults to coccidia as well, because they were stressed and infected, and then also got other parasitic infections too, like the barber pole worm or Haemonchus contortus. This seems to be the #1 parasite other than coccidia for goats and sheep. It is a parasitic roundworm infection, and it's the most significant helminth parasite, so actually a worm versus a protozoa. It is a blood-sucking worm, so this causes anemia. So if you look at the FAMACHA scorecard, you can see the little squares on the bottom basically represent the different levels of anemia. You can see that A and B are a nice red color, so we've got proper blood flow and hemoglobin production. Square C, we're starting to get a little pale, so we need to watch her. Maybe we need to treat her. And then you can see D and E are very pale to white, and we're in the danger zone. So not only will you see that in the eyelids, you might see some of the secondary symptoms as well. So bottle jaw, if you look underneath the jaw of the goat, if they've got a nice little pouch kind of hanging there and it looks fluid filled, that tends to be a sign of a heavy parasite load, particularly of Haemonchus contortus. You're going to see some unthriftiness in the animals, as well as dehydration. So again, we want to FAMACHA score these goats to see if they need treating. We want to do fecal tests again, make sure that the eggs that are present are actually the worm that we are treating for. And again, pasture management. So if you look at the top picture, the life cycle of the worm, you can see that the majority of infection actually happens out on pasture. And so the L3 stage of the worm actually will migrate up the grass blades in the early morning dew. And they travel about 4 inches. So if you keep your pasture at 6 inches or higher, your goats will not nibble down to the root of the grass and then can ingest the L3 worm, as well as if you let the goats out to graze after the morning dew dries up, the L3 will not have been able to travel anymore because they don't have that water for mobility. If you also look at the picture, you can actually see why it's called the barber pole worm, because it's red and white striped and it looks like one of those poles that used to be put outside of a barber shop. Very clever naming there. Another parasite to worry about is the meningeal worm or deer worms. This is very common in white-tailed deer. So if you've got deer on your farm, you should be on the lookout for this. It does not affect deer. They are their normal host. And so they have a symbiotic relationship where the deer and the worms can live together. It does require land snails or slugs as an intermediate host. So it will not just, appear out of nowhere. If you have deer and you have these snails or slugs, there is a good chance you might get some deer worms. And this causes serious neurological disease. Since goats are not their normal host, the worm actually travels to their spinal cord and can get into their brain. And so you will see a lot of neurological signs. You might see some back end lameness. You might see animals not being able to get up, depending on how severe of an infection it is. However, if you do catch this early, the chance of recovery is pretty high if it's treated, but you still might have some lingering effects. So, you want to make sure that if you do have this, you treat it early. and you use a treatment that can penetrate the spinal column. Because again, this is where the worm's going to go in and infect the goat. So it's a very serious worm to be on the lookout for, and just kind of have it in the back of your mind. Again, not trying to scare anybody or, doom and gloom, but it is out there, and it is a serious concern for goat farms that have, a wild deer population. But in general, goats are fun. They are great to have around. They've got lots of personality. They provide lots of hours of entertainment. And although we did go over some, issues that goats can have, again, it pays off. Knowing what to look for is half the battle, and understand how to treat them and, prevent these things is also very important. So although it might not be on an approved ration that Jeff creates, this goat here, she absolutely loved her Dunkin' Donuts, and she would eat munchkins all day if you let her. So sometimes it's worthwhile giving them a treat, not every day, but when they do things for you and they've earned it, a munchkin is, I think, very well warranted. So thank you guys. If you have any questions, please type them into Ingrid so we can answer them for you. Hopefully you guys found this at least a little informative and wanting to learn more about goats, or hopefully get into goats.
I think you're muted.
No, I did it. Mineral deficiencies. What do they look like? What are the most common ones, I guess? I know copper and selenium are important for goats.
Yeah, so they are, just like most other animals, selenium is very important for muscle development as well as for immunity. And unfortunately, most of our soils, at least down here in the United States, are selenium deficient. So we need to make sure that we are supplementing with appropriate levels of selenium. However, selenium can also be toxic. So there's a fine line of how much you should add until you can't anymore. On the same side is copper. So again, a lot of people feel that sheep and goats are similar, and everybody is told as soon as they get into sheep that sheep can't have copper because it's toxic, all that fun stuff. But in reality, goats actually do have a higher requirement for copper than sheep do. And so it's easier for a goat to become copper deficient than a sheep. And usually you see this in their coat quality. One of the first signs of a copper or even a zinc deficiency can be if you look at their tail head. And if the tail kind of looks very fishtaily and frayed and there's a bald spot, that usually tends to be a sign of either copper or zinc. Same with any like tinniness or rustiness in their coat. If you've got a black goat and she's starting to look a little red, that tends to be going into the minerals as well.
Okay. Alyssa, was there, any kind of symptoms that you're noticing maybe in your goats that you were wondering about? Maybe we can approach it that way in case this does not answer your question. And while you're typing that, so in the US, you have this nice product that's called Goat NutriBalancer, and there might be some people here who are from the States. What can Canadian people do for their goats if they want to give them Fertrell?
So y'all have the Canadian Grazer's Choice.
Yep.
It's quite similar to the Grazer's Choice that we produce out down here for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to have salt, kelp, calcium, phosphorus, selenium, and vitamin E. If you want to add copper to make it the equivalent of our Grazer's Choice with copper that we only have down here in the US, you would add, I did the math earlier because this will come up. You would need to add to each 50-pound or 27.27 kilogram bag of Grazer's Choice in Canada, you would have to add 0.2 pounds of copper sulfate. that also equates to 3.5 ounces or 90 grams.
Okay, now I have another question because I believe that Joel Salatin is using his own mixture of Fertrell stuff to give to his grazing animals. Jeff, you want to cover that?
Right. And he has been now for 15 or so years. But so his mixture, he takes the poultry NutriBalancer. He does 1 bag of poultry NutriBalancer, 1 bag of kelp, and a half a bag of salt. And every animal on his farm, all of his ruminants, all of his grazing animals that don't get any grains and any supplementation, that is his free choice mineral mix for all the cattle, all the sheep, all the goats, everything that he's got. You know, that's what everybody gets. And actually, if you compare the tag on the goat NutriBalancer to the poultry NutriBalancer, they're very, very similar. Okay. Now, I would still add the copper that Baylor talked about, you know, roughly that 3.5, 4 ounces to each bag of poultry NutriBalancer, just to bring it up. But otherwise, when you're looking at like calcium, phosphorus, probiotics, everything else, there's a lot of similarities between goat NutriBalancer and poultry NutriBalancer. And, you know, back when Rachel was talking about the 1.4 to 1 calcium to phosphorus ratio, I found as I travel around and talk to different people, there's a lot of bad information about where that calcium phosphorus ratio is. I was just recently in Wisconsin, and you know, an animal service person, you know, for a larger feed company, he was out pushing 2, 3, you know, 3 to 1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. He was pushing much higher levels of calcium. And when you do that, you're almost for sure going to have to treat all the bucks for urinary calculi with ammonium chloride. So I mean, we do something, we think we see a positive response, but you know, we're not calculating for the negative side effects when we do that. You know, so if you feed that high calcium, you might as well have the ammonium chloride in the feed, because you're going to need it, or you're going to need to have it standing by, because yeah, your bucks are going to have problems. And but the leading goat the leading goat nutrition universities like Lansden and actually here Penn State has been doing a lot of goat work. They're pretty much on the same line of that 1.4, maybe 1.5 to 1 ratio. And they're getting people off of feeding alfalfas and legumes to their goats because the side effects, you know, people don't realize it. They think alfalfa is wonderful, right? Or clover is wonderful. And in some aspects it is, but it's throwing off the mineral imbalance horribly. I mean, horribly. It makes it almost impossible to balance. When we're trying to balance a diet at Fertrell, somebody who wants to feed higher levels of alfalfa, you know, we can't get it where we want it to be, right? They weren't really cut out to eat legumes. They're really browsers more than they are grazers. I mean, we've kind of forced them into our world. They'd be a lot happier, you know, chewing on brush and, you know, briars and brambles than they would be actually eating grass. But
that might also make them less susceptible to coccidia if you actually let them eat what they are. You know, Joel would call that the goatness of the goat.
Right.
And you know, if you are able to actually let them do that, you know, they would things would be different for them. Some of those issues that we're dealing with are a consequence of, you know, what's being fed to them because it's easier. I mean, not everybody has acres of brushes where they can let their goats loose.
Well, and people want their land to look pretty, so they put it into hay fields and they want to mow it, or they put it into pastures and they want to mow it. But a goat would actually thrive, in a brushy lot that you've let grow up for 3 to 4 years without mowing it. Things like willows, I don't know if you have wild raspberry plants up there,
Yeah.
short willows, bush willows, raspberries, autumn olives. I mean, that's really, even some multiflower rose, if you have that up there. I mean, they would thrive on those forages or forbs, but nobody wants their property to look all trashy and junky with weeds growing. So, we force them into grazing on cultured grasses and legumes.
Yeah, our goats always enjoyed the fall when the leaves would fall off the trees and they had all this other source of, fodder that they can then eat, more along the lines of what they would normally go for.
Yeah.
That's when they really had fun.
Yeah, and certain leaves actually have really good nutritional components. Like, all of the oak family, and it varies, but all of the oak family, like I talked about the willows as well, they're really high in tannins. And in the fall of the year, goats would have enough intelligence, much like the white-tailed deer, to eat a bunch of tannins in, say, September, October, because the tannins reduce the parasite load going into winter naturally. But we're so far away from the natural design of how we raise our animals. We're missing the forest for the trees, literally, when it comes to raising goats. But we want pretty properties, right? But yeah, I mean, goats really were not, other than the boar goats for meat purposes, because they've developed them to be that grazing goat. But all the other goats were made to be put in hedgerows and woodlots and brush lots. And that's really where they thrive, with a little bit of supplementation at the barn.
Right. So I have the follow-up question from Melissa. One of my doe's coats was looking kind of rough, and I gave her full access to loose minerals.
I mean, it could also be the time of year, shedding their winter coat, coming into spring. Some goats have a lot of down on them, and they might need some extra help shedding out too, which, I mean, it can be a symptom of mineral deficiency as well. But if she's feeding a balanced ration, she should have plenty of copper and zinc in there. She could always get a blood panel done by, a veterinarian to confirm if, something is low in the blood. If it's just looking kind of rough, it could be minerals. It could be an underlying parasite issue, as parasites do cause, coats to look rough in general. Or again, just time of year and having issues shedding out.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. If there's no discoloration, if it's just rough hair coat and undercoat that didn't shed out right, I'd take a look that maybe there's not enough protein, because that hair cycling is directly tied to the right amount of protein, but the right quality of protein, right? Because if you measured the protein of hair, it's actually quite high. And those hair follicles are going to be dependent on that. So if you didn't have the right kind of protein or enough protein, really breaking it down, if we didn't have the right amino acids, that could lead to a slower shedding or cycling of the hair coat.
Okay, and then I'm copying a question here from Christine. Christine says, I see a lot of recipes posted online that are just oats, barley, and
black oil sunflower seeds, our favorite.
Based on what I'm seeing in the charts, that has minimal protein. Am I correct in that assumption?
That is
Yes.
low protein.
That is low protein. And then there's another.
I mean, you're looking at 10 for oats, 12 for barley at best. And depending, I mean, Canadian barley would be 11 or 12. 10 for oats, 12 for barley, and Boss is only 17. So this is going to be somewhere between around 12, 13 protein. And goat people are just drunk on black oil sunflower seeds. I mean, they're addicted. I mean, they can't help themselves. But
I would give a handful on the stand, but I used it more for getting the extra fat into them. I
Right.
knew it wasn't going to add much else to it.
right, you weren't as bad as most that I see. I mean, people are going broke buying 50-pound bags of black oil sunflower seeds just because their goats love them, right? And they feel good about it. It gives them a warm, fuzzy feeling, really, is what it boils down to. But there are alternatives to black oil sunflower seeds.
Okay, I've got another one here from Christine still. Would you recommend grass hay compared to alfalfa hay? Many people I know supplement grass hay with alfalfa pellets. What would your recommendation be?
She should be at least 4 or 5 parts grass hay, very little alfalfa pellets or hay. Keep it to a minimum, not more than 20% of the diet, and that, without seeing a test, could be risky at 20%. I would say more like 10% of the total diet. So it's not a lot. I'm not saying not to feed it. Um, you know, we're taking a guess on prairie hay, nutritional content, and what the nutritional content of the alfalfa is. But I would say keep it under 20% of the diet.
All right. And there is still from Christine. Can you speak on the topic of tree fodder at all? We're considering trying something like this to supplement our goats' pasture access.
I don't know the term tree fodder. Do you know anybody, Rachel?
I mean, the only thing I can think of is a lot of people like to feed used Christmas trees after Christmas season, and I'm wondering if this is what she's talking about.
Okay.
So similar to what Baylor was saying with poisonous plants, you do have to be careful with pine trees and with yews. Like a yew tree, they can still, even though the goats do like them, they can still be harmful to the goats too. So you do need to be careful about it. And again, not all trees are created equal. Some are poisonous and some are not, and depending on what you're getting from them, you could be doing more harm than good. Obviously like black walnut and, even black cherry and things like that, you want to be, aware of and making sure that it's a safe species to be feeding them.
I think she's talking about coppicing for tree, to produce tree hay, it's called. It's kind of a niche thing. There are some books written on it. I don't know the names of them, but I would point her in that direction. It's just the habit of you chop a tree off at around shoulder level and then it grows out shoots. You cut those shoots off and feed them.
Yeah,
You're on mute, Jeff.
I'm not sure if she's referring to cut and carry or if she just wants to chop the tree and make it bush out as a grazing opportunity.
Okay.
And that would be great. And like I said, there's some European willows that'll grow well in our climates over here in North America that have a really good output of dry matter or forage or foliage. So, and you get the secondary benefits of some tannin in there to keep parasites under control. So I don't know what kind of tree, but
so here. So she says willows are one we are considering as a grazing opportunity.
Yeah. I see that quite a bit. The willows are really beneficial for a lot of the small ruminants, both sheep and goat. They're a deeper taproot. They're going to pull up really nice micronutrients, trace minerals. So I would give that some strong consideration. Again, if you can get some wild raspberries to grow and start creating like a hedgerow, they'll love to chew on those as well, especially in the fall. But I think the willows are a great idea.
Yes. And this is from Melissa. Can you get hay tested to find out the quality?
we can in the States. I don't know. Do you have a forage lab up there, Ingrid? I know you do. I just don't know where to point somebody in Canada.
Yeah, I think Alyssa is in the States.
Okay.
I think
Yep.
she is. Yes.
Yeah, there's plenty of labs down here, to get that done. She can reach out to us after the fact. And then, if she wants us to review it, she can send it to Dairyland Labs and make sure she puts Fertrell on it. So they know how to test it. They know what to do with it. And there's 5 Dairyland Labs, I believe, in the U.S. So there should be. Okay. Yeah, we can get it tested, Alyssa. Tests are running right around $49 per sample, just so you don't get sticker shock when it's all said and done. And that's exactly what the lab charges us, that we make nothing on that. You can send it yourself to Dairyland Labs if you want, and then just forward us the report, and we can take a look at it and tell you what we see.
I have another question here. What type of willows are you recommending goat owners plant?
I can't tell you the species right off the top of my head. I know it was a Mediterranean willow. It doesn't grow real tall like a tree. It's more of it's really good hillside. It's brushy. As long as you don't let it get away from you, and you top it at 5 or 6 feet, so the goats can still come in and graze it. But it's a strong rootstock, and it recovers very quickly. But I'd have to dig around and get the actual name. I just years ago I heard Jerry Bernetti talk about a Mediterranean variety of willow that they're bringing in. But pretty much any willow is going to do the same job. You just have to manage it at a bush or brush level and keep topping it so it doesn't get out of control, and it'll force more out of the root. And there's a lot of native willow, in North America. When I visited Alaska, most of the moose and the ruminants up there were living off of willow bushes, and that was their primary forage source.
Okay, I'm going to put here. This is the email address where anybody who wants to get more information or send analysis or ask questions, if you are in the States, that's where you can reach Baylor, Rachel, or Jeff. And if you need to reach us here in Canada, this is our email. No.
And I'd recommend anybody that's emailing from Canada,
Yeah.
please copy Ingrid in, even if you email us directly at Livestock, so she knows what's going on, so she can better, address the situation for you across the border. But yeah, and Livestock at Fertrell comes to all 3 of us at the same time.
Yes. I was going to cover this one. What are the advantages of offering kelp meal to goats? Free choice. This is sheep, and I know sheep is not goats, but when we had sheep, when we introduced kelp, it took care of prolapses. So I know that it's good stuff. And a lot of people who have goats come to us, they will take the grazer's choice, mix it with some kelp. So what does kelp do for goats?
We know anecdotally what kelp does for pretty much all livestock.
Mm-hmm.
You get better health, you get better reproductive performance, you support the immune system. The iodine of it goes directly into supporting the thyroid system and the entire endocrine system. But there's other things in kelp because of all the minerals that it's absorbing out of the ocean water as it passes along the coastline. We don't know everything about kelp. We do know that this variety of seaweed, Ascophyllum nodosum, that we're harvesting along the Maine coast, Nova Scotia, Ireland, Iceland, they've got records of feeding that. Actually, they would take their small ruminants down to the shoreline at low tide and let them graze on the kelp along the shoreline all summer long. When the weather was possible that they could get down there and graze it. So this has been going on for more than 2,000 years, right? Kelp isn't new. And, farmers back then saw the benefits of the kelp, all summer long when they could get down there, or they would actually go down, cut and carry it and bring it up when they couldn't get the animals to the kelp. But yeah, but we really don't know. I mean, everybody's got a theory about what kelp does for animals, and we're still figuring it out. And there's just no money to go test it and figure out why it does what it does. But kelp is the best mineral out there, period, right? If you can only afford to feed one thing to your animals, start with kelp, right? And then go from there.
That's probably why you use kelp in all your...
Everyone.
In your...
Every mineral.
In your NutriBalancers. That might actually be the Fertrell secret weapon.
Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody.
It's on your ingredient list. Come on.
Okay.
And then one more thing here. Goats and pneumonia. Supposedly they're very susceptible to it. They need maybe extra protection from rain and wind. Is there something that you can do, nutrition-wise, to strengthen them, to make sure they have that super duper working immune system?
So yeah, again, anything that's going to boost their immune system. So extra vitamin E, making sure that everything is balanced, they're getting a good diet. Again, it's also going to come down to management, making sure that if it's going to be warm and humid out, you can keep them cool. And you can keep the barn as dry as possible. Or again, if they're out in the pasture and they don't have access to a close barn, making sure that they do have shelter to get out of the rain, get out of the wind, just like any animal. And being aware of, again, usually around kidding time, because it's late winter, early spring, into the late springtime. And, so they are usually a little bit more confined and they're already in a stressed state, being aware of, if they're sounding raspy or what's going on. Also, if they have a heavy parasite load and then all of a sudden you've got a really hot and humid day, they can aspirate and get a really acute case of pneumonia too. They do seem to get it a lot, but again, it's supporting that immune system, making sure that they're getting fed a complete diet. And management and making sure that you're doing what you can to try to ward it off. It sucks. I'm just going to say it bluntly. It does suck. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it.
And I don't know so much that it's the rain and the wind. I think it's more related to humidity after the rain and a lack of airflow, right? I think we put them in confined spaces and we don't keep the air quality what it should be. Or for us, hot summer days, we have a higher humidity. They just, if that air is not moving, they're going to be suffering. We see a lot of summer pneumonia in all the ruminants. It's not uncommon at all. Yeah, and if the air is just not moving, and once that humidity gets high, it's, supporting the immune system is going to be the right answer. And keeping that kelp out there, free choice by itself. Look, buying kelp is scary. I mean, the price of kelp is going to keep getting worse because the supply, isn't what it used to be, and the demand is higher. So kelp is your best friend. It's your number one mineral.
When you've said that this is for poultry, and when you purchase animals from, a different producer and you bring them into your property, you want to have them on quarantine. What's the type of quarantine that you, lengthwise, time-wise, that you recommend for goats? Because they come to your place, they're going to be stressed. So if there is any disease, this is prime time for it to come out. What's the length of time you recommend you keep them separated before you put them into with your herd?
If you can quarantine them for 2 weeks, that would be great. I mean, the longer you can keep them separated so that they can get acclimated to your environment and you can see if anything is going on and then treat them for it, the better. So a minimum of 2 weeks would be great if you can swing that. Obviously, it's not always possible depending on what your setup is to be able to do that. But that would be a good incubation time for if they have anything for it to come to head, or anything like that.
Okay, so let's say that tomorrow I go out to try to buy a dairy goat. What are the red flags? If I'm looking at an animal, what would be something that would say, don't buy it?
Well, first I would want to ask if I'm allowed to take a blood sample and get her tested for some diseases that you might not be able to see. That's just me personally. I want to make sure she doesn't have CAE. She's coming from a brucellosis-free, a Johne's-free, a TB-free farm, things like that. And if the producer has a recent blood test, or that would be sufficient for me. But if they don't, I want to take blood before I'm taking her onto my property. Any of those things can be herd killers, basically, and where you wouldn't want them in the herd. You don't want them to have any weird lumps on them, because you want to make sure they don't have CL. So if you've got lumps along like lymph node areas, anything that looks kind of like a peach pit, so there's no hair on it and it's kind of like wrinkly and definitely not oozing. You don't want anything like that. So those are the common things that I would look at. Obviously, if they do give them shots for any reason, whether it's, to treat them or for vaccination, making sure that it's an injection site abscess versus a CL lump. So for that reason, one of the common vaccines that goat producers use is an 8-way vaccine for different Clostridium bacteria, causing, tetanus, enterotoxemia, blackleg. They give it underneath the arm, kind of in the armpit. And so that way, if there is, because that vaccine does tend to cause abscesses. So if there's an abscess under the arm, it tends to be from that vaccine. And most common producers are aware of that. If they have health records, obviously being able to see that. Same thing with walking into any barn. You don't want snotty noses. You don't want to hear raspiness, poopy butts. Mm-hmm. You want the animals to be up and lively, things like that.
And don't fall in love with the goat until you do a health check and check them over. Okay, it's hard not to. Once you look them in the eye and you see them, it's hard to say no. But you need to make an intelligent decision before you take it home.
Yes, I was listening to actually a podcast about how to choose your perfect dairy cow. And that's the first thing that people say. Don't go visit the cow. Don't go see the cow with money and trailer, money in your pocket and your animal trailer. You go look at the cow and then you sleep over it. You don't be either pressed because you think that you won't find another one, or take your time to ask questions, to get maybe health records, and keep it cool. But I know that those goats can be pretty cute.
You really want to, you want to, so people that are going out and thinking about getting a couple goats or something, for their homestead or whatever, really need to call someone like Rachel or myself or whatever and get that list of questions and things to look for before you go, right? And be very well educated before you go starting to look for goats. Mm-hmm. You also want to get references. You want to ask around, make sure that you're buying from a reputable breeder. I mean, there's a lot to it, because, who wants the heartbreak of buying a goat, bringing it home, and it dies 2 weeks later, right? And it looked fine when you were there. Mm-hmm. So you need to know all the right questions.
Or horror stories of people who decide that they want to go, so they go to the sale barn. There's a reason why
Okay.
animals are at the sale barn.
Yeah.
And they bring these animals home thinking that they can rehab them or save them. And if they already have animals in their barn, they've just introduced who knows what into their scenario. So yeah, just like Jeff said, you want to find reputable breeders, especially if you're looking for specific breeds. Go around there. At least here, in the States, I mean, we're in the prime of show season right now, and I know just in Pennsylvania, Maryland area, there's probably at least a half a dozen shows going on every weekend that you can go to and talk to reputable breeders and people who are doing this, because they love it and they've spent the time and the research to find the good genetics and things like that.
Yeah, I have another question here. I got my goats tested this year, and my vet said he didn't suggest testing for CL because it has false positives. I notice a lot of people test for it in their panels. What are your thoughts?
So I only test for CL, or I would only test for CL an actual abscess and get the bacteria cultured in the pus that was being generated. That's the only time I actually tested for CL. If there's an actual abscess. The other issue too is people who are vaccinating for CL. That's what can cause false positives. Once they've introduced the bacterium into the system, it can cause issues like that too. So as I didn't typically test for it unless I had a suspicious abscess, and we can aspirate it and get an airtight sample so that it wasn't being thrown into the environment. So actually, again, aspirating the abscess with a needle and a syringe and drawing out the pus that way, and then sending it off to the lab to get tested.
Next questions. How many goats minimum? Are they going to be lonely if you just have one? Should you have two so they have company? Should you have three so that if one dies, you still have two?
I thought you were asking me how many goats I wanted. But no, you should definitely have two goats. They do like company. But goat math is just like chicken math.
Oh yeah.
You start off with two, and then before you know it, you don't know what happened. But I mean, you think about it, if you're breeding them, you get two does, they're going to have anywhere from 1 to 4 kids. So if they each have quads, now you're up to 10 goats in 1 year. And are you going to keep all of them? What are you going to do with them?
Of course you are. Come on. Of course you are. You're going to name them. They're going to be part of the family, because if they have quads, you're going to be bottle feeding some in the house, right? How do you sell those? Right.
It does make it tough, but yeah, no, goats do like company. They are very social animals. They definitely have a hierarchy in the barn. Who's the queen? Who's the top dog? And they'll let you know that. We had an old goat who was definitely queen of the barn. Her grandmother was actually named Queen, so it worked out very nicely. But one of my former coworkers brought her young son in, and we would put them in the pens just because we're like, well, if they're in the pens, they can't get out, and we can do what we need to do. Well, she did not like him running back and forth, and she let him know that by headbutting him to knocking him over.
Mm-hmm.
So they will quite quickly put anybody in place that they are not happy with. But yes, they are still social animals, and they like having company. So,
all right. Are there any other questions that we can cover now? I'm trying to make sure that I'm not missing any. Oh, here. There we go. I don't know why I have questions that are going different places instead of the usual comments here. So let me put this in. This is from Christine. Okay. There you go. To transition away from alfalfa hay, which is what our breeder was feeding, do you recommend a slow transition, offering both grass and alfalfa, and change the quantities of both over a period of time?
As with any feed change, you always want to do it gradually so that the rumen bacteria can adjust to the changes. Jeff said earlier about, you can feed both of them at the same time, and it's absolutely fine, obviously, with a little bit more grass hay than alfalfa hay. And that's what we typically did. We never just fed straight alfalfa hay. We always had both a good Timothy available at the same time as alfalfa.
All right. Let me double check things here. I hope I didn't miss anybody. I think that's... Oh, what's the best way to catch a goat once they escape?
Pray. They can be slippery little buggers. If you can get a hind leg and snatch it and then quickly grab its neck so you don't break its leg, that's sometimes the only thing that you can do. Having multiple people so that you can blockade them is going to be a good thing. Or if you have other goats that you can try to wrangle them with, you just have to hope that they didn't get out too far.
Can you bribe them with treats?
It depends. Most of them know when it's feeding time and they'll come running if they hear the feed scoop. If you're feeding green, so you can. It just depends.
Yeah, I remember taking a sheep to be slaughtered, and it managed to actually, the slaughterhouse was close to a very open field. Okay, and it managed to go under, to somehow escape before we kind of put it through the door. And he was just, the open world was right in front of him. I think the manager of the farm never ran that fast before or after that, but they caught it. They caught it. So if there is no other question, I think we can let you go to bed because you're 2 hours ahead of us. So that make you 9 o'clock.
I'm ready.
You're ready? Yeah, I'm ready too, and it's only 7.
Bedtime's a priority the older you get. So
Yeah. So if there is no more questions, I will just say thank you to everyone for coming, for bringing your questions. Thank you, Rachel, for your hard work on this presentation. Thank you, Baylor. Thank you, Jeff. And we'll have to think about the next one.
okay, it was fun.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
always fun to talk about goats. I don't want to own any, but it was fun to talk about goats. So
Yeah, I'm still considering owning some, but it was very fun. I did a lot of research because we had sheep, but not
well,
goats.
you have that brushy hillside that you don't know what to do with, so it kind of makes sense for you.
Well, that's where I want to put them.
Right.
Put them. That's absolutely where I want to put them. But
Yeah.
I've got to build some shelter for them first, and then talk to Trevor.
I don't know. Good
So-
luck with that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you never know. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. See you.
Yeah. Bye.